Hello, my name is Chris Beaumont and I'm one of the partners at Clive Owen LLP, and today with my colleague Kevin Shotton we'll be going through the Academy's Benchmarking Report 2023. The benchmarking report this year is slightly different to previous years in that it actually includes some data from some non-Kreston financial. That's because we wanted to include some larger multi-academy trusts within the report. So this year what you'll notice as you go through the report is that the multi-academy trust this year we've split. So we've got those that have got less than 3,000 pupils based on the cut-off point for SCA/SIF monies for capital projects, those between 3,000 and 7,500 pupils, and then those above 7,500 pupils using the government's definition of a strong trust. So we'll start with an overview, looking at the in-year sort of surpluses which have been achieved by the various categories of trusts. And as you can see here, primary stat, basically we've got a loss in the year of about 40,000 compared to sort of small surpluses within the other categories. What is very noticeable though is that the 2022 numbers or surpluses are significantly smaller than the 21. And that's because in 2021 there was some significant additional monies provided by the government towards the end of that financial year. Kevin in a moment will talk about the impact of the cost increases which have started to come through in the latter part of the year. On that basis I'll pass across to Kevin.
Thanks, Chris. We'll start by looking at the income side of things. So starting with average income per pupil, it's worth noting that in terms of getting this figure, we include capital income, but we exclude any conversion income in that. One thing that stands out is that the income per pupil is fairly flat across the entire period, which really highlights the fact that income's been tracking a bit behind in inflation for a number of years. One figure that does jump out on the primary SAT, there does look like there's a big jump in income per pupil in the year. That is largely because within our data set there are a few primary trusts that have had fairly significant SIF bids, so one-off capital funding in this period. The next slide is honing in on the core funding, so the GAG income per pupil. If we look at the figures here, we can see an increase across the board. That is largely the consolidation of some of the income streams. So previously, teachers' pension income and the teachers' pay award income grants were received separately. Now they have been amalgamated into the core GAG income. When we were looking at income streams and changes, one interesting thing that came out of the benchmarking was just the correlation between COVID-19 income and trading income. So the drop in trading and the increase in COVID funding that we saw in 2021 is now reversed. You can see quite a strong increase in other trading income. Again, that is probably coming from the fact that trusts are looking at generating other income to try and cope with some of the budgetary pressures that they're facing. One thing we would always advise as other trading income grows is obviously not to forget about some of the VAT and corporation tax implications associated or potentially associated with those other income streams. And then we've got a slide here which just highlights some of the new income streams. I think over the last few years there hasn't been a lot of new income, but at the back end of last year there were a number of welcome announcements, I think we call them, in terms of additional funding, which hopefully will go some way to address the real term drop that I referred to earlier in terms of funding. If I then move on to look at the cost side of things, won't surprise anyone that staffing costs continue to take up the lion's share of schools' budgets. If we look at the percentage of costs that staffing costs make up, in SATs and in primary SATs and maths, it's around about 74%. In secondary SATs, it's around about 78%. Those percentages are fairly static year on year, which I think reflects the fact that unfortunately costs are going up across the board. In terms of the increases that we see on that slide in terms of total staff costs per pupil, again that reflects general inflationary pressures on salaries, such as the the backdated support staff pay awards that have impacted the current year. And then honing in on teacher salaries themselves, again, looking at the data, you can see that salaries were kind of flat over the previous 4 years, but we are seeing some fairly significant jumps this year, which I think is probably reflective of the challenges in recruitment and retention of teaching staff at present. And then turning to supply costs, again we can see that supply costs for 2022 are sort of higher than the comparative year. Quite noticeable is the primary SAT statistic there, where we're showing a 76% increase on the prior year. Thoughts on that really is it probably comes from the fact that there aren't surplus staff or other department staff who can be utilised to cover shortages as absences have increased as restrictions ended during the year. And then talk a little bit on non-staffing costs. So there's been a general increase in costs across the board, as we've alluded to earlier. Some of that is largely down to the fact that during the pandemic years, some costs dropped off with pupils not being in school all of the time. One figure that does jump out when we look at the current year numbers are heat and light costs. That's something that's not just impacting on the school sector, but obviously the economy as a whole. Whilst the increases are fairly significant at the minute, I think the reality is that they're probably going to increase further as well, because a number of trusts are still in fixed price contracts, so haven't had the full impact of this. And even in the current year, there has obviously been some government support, which will change from April and be less generous than it has been to date. The only other thing to pull out on other costs is are the changes in food costs or catering costs, where we're seeing increases of between 9 and 20%. The higher end of the range again seems to sit at the primary SAT level, where we're seeing those 20% increases. In terms of our survey that we put out, it was interesting to see that that 2/3 of respondents at kind of primary SAT level thought that actually the funding they receive for free school meals and universal infant free school meals no longer covers the cost of providing that service. So again, that's potentially part of the reason why we're seeing the impact hitting harder at primary level. I'll then just talk about a couple of MAT ratios or statistics. The first is just the top slice percentage. So since we started doing this benchmarking report, 5% has been the most common top slice percentage that's been used. In the current year, you can see there is a move away to higher percentages, particularly the 6 and 7% bracket. Some of that will undoubtedly be because of inflationary pressures, but also likely that more costs or more functions are being centralised as well, and the need to pass that cost on to the schools. And then gag pooling again is a topic that generates a lot of discussion. We are seeing more trusts starting to consider gag pooling, and the numbers kind of back that up in terms of schools who've moved to some form of pooling over the year. So now 23% of MATs within our data are adopting some form of pooling. It's worth just highlighting actually that is seen more at the what Chris referred to before as the stronger MAT level, so those with over 7,500 pupils, where that percentage is actually up at 54% as opposed to the 23% in general. And at that point I'll pass back to Chris to look at some balance sheet ratios.
Right, I'm going to start the balance sheet review by just looking at the reserves of multi-academy trusts, as I mentioned earlier, and as Kevin's just mentioned, split between sort of the small, medium and strong MATs. And what you can sort of see here is that small MATs, the reserves generally have sort of stayed rather static, similarly for sort of medium-sized multi-academy trusts. But where we've got a fairly substantial increase at around those strong MATs, those sorts of ones with 7,500 plus pupils, that result is slightly distorted by the fact of we've got some sort of non-Kreston data within here, but only marginally. but you can sort of see the general sort of growth here is actually in the size of those trusts. What you can see for the strong trusts is a substantial increase. That in part reflects the fact that we've got some non-Kreston financial data within this report, but also reflects the fact that trusts are growing, and therefore as they're growing you'd expect the reserves of those trusts to increase. So if we actually then sort of go back to our sort of usual way of looking at things, which is average free reserves per pupil, I've gone back here now to sort of primary, secondary stat, and then multi-academy trust, and grouping them all together. What you can sort of see is a sort of an increase in the sort of primary, static in the secondary, and then a sort of drop off in the multi-academy trust. And at first glance it seems a little odd. Part of that is to do with demographics and the fact that there is a sort of bulge moving through the system. And because of the way that that bulge moves through and the way that funding occurs, as in it's lagged by a year, it does sometimes mean that actually the primary schools retain some more of that funding for a little while sort of then the secondaries take on the pupils but don't actually get the funding. In respect of the multi-academy trusts, the number going down there is probably a reflection of a number of things. One of the most noticeable is the fact that the National Audit Office mentioned the fact that those trusts holding more than sort of 20% of income as reserves should be questioned by effectively the SFA, and that was backed up by the Public Accounts Committee, who also sort of have questioned why trusts should be holding more than 20%. So there's definitely more scrutiny coming for those trusts in due course, and therefore they're probably thinking, well, actually we probably do need to spend some more of those monies now, possibly on sort of capital projects. And we've got to remember here that capital projects for the last 2 years have really been put on hold by a lot of trusts. There's also sort of potentially political uncertainty as well. What would a change of government mean in due course? Would it mean that actually there could be some sort of clawback, some sort of redistribution? Could it mean a reintroduction of the 12% gag limit that we actually had a few years ago? Labour haven't really come out and actually said what their policy will be on that. All they've said is academisation will continue in one form or another. Average capital expenditure is up at both the primary and secondary stat levels, and that's not unexpected in some respects, because as Kevin's mentioned earlier on, there were some spikes by a number of sort of primary schools in the way the sort of the monies were coming in, and therefore not unexpectedly the money's going out on the other side. You've also got the delay in all the capital projects which have happened over the last few years. So what that's meant is sort of the trusts are trying to do a sort of catch up at this moment in time. So I mean, I'm involved in a trust as a non-exec, and there we've now got the SIF projects complete from 2020, 2021, and the 2022 ones are just about complete. But it shows you the fact that there's the possibility of having a significant number of SIF projects on the go at any one point in time. And one of our clients had about 14 projects on the go as at the 31st of August 22, which is obviously a significant estate management issue when you're trying to get all those projects through at the same time. It's also sort of worthwhile saying that trusts are also sort of considering their position with the SIF, because what we've seen over the last few years, and again Kevin's talked about before, is the inflationary impact that's coming through. And that's not just on sort of the cost of food and heat and light, but also actually on sort of building materials. And therefore we've got a number of clients which are considering their position in respect of the SIF monies that they've received. They've put an application in based on some quotes that they've got, but now they're actually coming to actually do that work. Is that sort of funding sufficient to actually do the necessary work? And in some cases it's a question of, yes, the trust is in a position to use some of its reserves, as I've just mentioned. In some cases they could rescale the project and possibly look at something which is a little bit smaller than before, and in an extreme case obviously not go ahead with the project at all and return the money to the SFA. It's worthwhile remembering though, if you are rescaling the project, to actually ensure that you actually let the SFA know what you're doing there, because there was one case, albeit a slightly extreme case recently, whereby one trust who hadn't spent the SIF money as the SFA thought they should spend it, has actually had a request to claw back £1.5 million and actually got a financial notice to improve at the same time. Obviously a very, very big impact on the trust if that sort of thing was to happen. So we'd advise all trusts, if they are sort of rescaling a project, just to make sure with the SFA that there's no issues around that. The other thing to mention is around sort of more of a focus on sort of energy conservation, stroke environmental projects. As Kevin pointed out earlier, there was a new pot of money came out just before Christmas, £500 million worth of monies, the equivalent of about 29,000 for a primary and 42,000 for a secondary, which was there to be used on energy efficiency projects, so sort of lagging of pipes, LED lighting, new sort of energy controls, some obvious easy wins there. If anybody is considering LED lighting, there are some companies out there that offer leases, so just make sure if somebody does offer you a lease, that you actually consider that lease and make sure that it is an operating lease and not a finance lease, because obviously the SFA at the moment do not allow finance leases. That may well change in the next couple of years, but at the moment they're currently banned, so please make sure it's an operating lease if you do look at LED lighting as one option. And it is a significant investment. I've got one client who's invested over £500 million in LED lighting. Payback period for them was about 7 years, and what they've used is reserves and current cash balance to actually enable that investment to take place. There's also been a change in the way that the government's looking to capture data around sort of environmental projects. So things like the way that sort of the SIF bids are actually reviewed is now looking more at a sort of the environmental side and actually what energy efficiency methods are actually being put in place. And there's actually a new category for projects being introduced, which is looking to replace those coal and oil fired boilers with more energy efficient ones in due course. So moving on to local government pension schemes. This is the pension scheme for the support staff, and what I think all trustees saw was a fairly substantial reduction in the liability as at the sort of the end of August 22. That drop came around because bond yields had changed dramatically, and you can see there that the average LGPS liability has dropped. What trusts need to focus on though is actually what the new employer rate will be from the 1st of April. And for a number of trusts, as we're recording this, they do not know what their rate's going to be from the 1st of April. But what we have seen in those trusts that have been advised so far is anything from a reduction of 1.5% up to an increase of 10%. I think those trusts, having seen the reductions that we're seeing on that screen there, were probably not expecting to actually see that their employer rate would change so dramatically upwards, having seen a fairly sizable reduction in the year-end accounting estimate that's included in the accounts. But you've got to remember, the way those two numbers are calculated is on a very different basis. And I thought it would be worthwhile including a sort of slide which just showed the variation in local government pension scheme employer rates. There's a lot of LGPS regions around the country, and within that, each trust will have its own rate as well. So there's a sizable variation. I mean, we've got some there less than 15%, some more than 22.6%. And looking at the data, there was one trust in Teesside that had an employer rate of 14.6. That was a strong multi-academy trust, which compared to a standalone trust in Leicestershire, which had a rate of 27%. Obviously a very, very sizable differential. And if we're talking about, say, £1 million worth of support staff costs, that equates to about £130,000, which could be the equivalent of sort of 3 newly qualified teachers. So it is a fairly significant difference across the sort of the country on that basis. In Devon, they've done things slightly differently to how they've done them elsewhere. And Devon's not the only example, but it's the one that comes to mind immediately. In actually what they've got there is actually a rate set for the county. So actually, rather than having an individual rate for a trust, they've actually got an employer rate set for, as I say, the county. And as a group, the writers of this report did suggest a few years ago to the government that actually it would be a good idea to actually have one rate on a national basis for all schools within England. On that basis, you could actually remove the need to do actuarial evaluations, which cost each school several £100 each time. Everybody would have the sort of the same rate, so it would be equitable between different trusts across the country. And it would actually remove some of the sort of potential movements within the year-end accounts, especially if you could actually, the LGPS no longer appeared, like the teachers' pension scheme no longer appears in the year-end accounts. So I know you all like to know what the average CEO head teachers' salaries are. And to be honest, it's been a modest increase in 2022 compared to 21. As you can see there, up by sort of a couple of grand on primaries. Secondaries even less, so that's a very small increase there. We think that's to do with the sort of the turnover of heads within our sample there, and that actually other people coming through, obviously at lower salaries than the ones that are leaving. And then within the MAT data, it looks like there's been a substantial increase there, but it's got to be remembered we've got some non-Kreston financial data in here, which will be the larger, stronger MATs, which by their very nature, their CEOs will have more pressure and more responsibility than the smaller trusts. Therefore, that has sort of distorted the numbers slightly there. But if you actually look at the underlying data for Kreston trusts, actually the increase in MAT heads is, well, remarkably small as a percentage. Where we're seeing the sort of the larger increase is around the Chief Financial Officer, and those salaries, especially in the sort of the secondaries and the multi-academy trusts, are moving up fairly substantially. And that's not surprising given the sort of the recruitment issues, actually trying to find sort of the Chief Financial Officer. When we sort of looked at how long it was taking typically for a trust to actually recruit a replacement if the CFO left, over about 20-25% were actually saying it took more than 4 months. And in one case, we've got an example of a trust which took over a year to find a replacement when their CFO left. So it is something that Academy Trusts are having to pay more attention to. And they're probably going to have a look at what industry is doing as well around sort of flexibility, and seeing whether within a school environment they can be more flexible in the role that the Chief Financial Officer undertakes, and how they undertake that, whether some of it can be done from home. Kevin and I in the last sort of 10-15 minutes have just tried to sort of canter through a few of the sort of the highlights within the report. We haven't touched things like governance or internal audit and risk management, which are included in the report. There's more details on all of those in the report. And if you'd like to get a copy, then please either download it from our website or email us and we'll send you a copy out either via email, or if you'd like a hard copy in due course, let us know and we'll post out some copies for you. So on behalf of Kevin and myself, thank you very much for watching this webinar. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to get in touch with us.